please consider supporting me on Patreon. Thank you. When we think of generations in society, it's easy to think of them primarily in the clear-cut lines we often hear about. Lost Gen, GI Gen, Silent Gen, Baby Boomers, Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z. These generational units separate billions of people into groupings with the goal of being able to identify, categorize, and ultimately recognize a population in time, all while utilizing historical events and roughly 20-year increments to, well, talk about people in time more easily. They are convenient, which further conditions their usage in everyday conversations and studies. And hearing that, one might not find an immediate problem with all of this. But being convenient doesn't make something good or even accurate. In some cases, it can create disingenuous oversimplifications. One of the biggest problems here is that there is no universal standard for how long any of these generations should be. For instance, the US Census Bureau unofficially recognizes millennials as somebody born in 1982 through 2000. The Pew Research Center has theirs go from 81 through 96, MetLife has theirs go from 77 through 94, and William Strauss and Neil Howe, makers of the Strauss-Howe generational theory, have theirs go through 82 through 2004. These discrepancies are not unique to millennials, and all of these parameters have been created for relatively different purposes. Censuses, research, insurance, hypotheses, though highlighting the seemingly subjective nature of this practice. Of course, each of these independent bodies had their generational units roughly in the same time frame, despite some extreme discrepancies ranging up to an entire decade. But all of this raises some interesting questions. Why 20 years? Why are generations treated as units and placed where they are? How applicable is this system to everybody? Are generations, these generations, real? Well, let's investigate. The concept of a social generation is not really a new idea. At least since the time of the ancient Greeks, there have been written acknowledgments of generational differences. Socrates is thought to have potentially not liked how young people enjoyed writing things down. It made them forgetful. Fortunately for him though, next-gen Plato would write down Socrates' ideas, keeping him from being forgotten. That said, it would be within the 1800s where this idea of organizing and categorizing generations started to come into fruition, along with some of the first official studies of generations, with notable ones being done by Auguste Comte. But it'd be within the 1850s, with works like that of Justin Grummel and Giuseppe Ferrari, where they developed arguments for the biological genealogical perspective. Here we start seeing an emphasis on the length of a generation. They used 15 to 30-year increments, being roughly how long it took for a new generation within a family to show up, and attempted to justify using that time span, grouping everybody born within it together, as a standard increment because they also speculated that it was innately tied to the passage of historical events, a historical generation attribute. In other words, significant events appear and impact people in a similar manner born within a 15 to 30-year time span. Our biological generations are rhythmically locked into increments that complement the flow of history. That relationship's byproduct are the societal generations we see according to them. Something which sounds supernatural. In the words of Hans Jaeger, they assume that there exists, as it were, an arithmetic bridge which links the biological genealogical rhythm of individual lives with the chronology of collective history. Their hypothesis led to future discussions about historical generations and often hazardous and mystical quality, since their adherents insist on a biologically determined rhythm, which cannot be explained through external experimental factors. This approach will be referred to here as the pulse rate, and that is today known as pulse rate hypothesis. Though named retroactively in the 1980s with Jaeger's publication, link in the description, there were earlier individuals who spoke out against pulse rate, particularly this rhythmic concept. Influential sociologists like that of Karl Mannheim pushed quite extensively against pulse rate as being non-scientific. Mannheim's work, which influenced Arthur Sitchcom's work, would develop into what has become now known as imprint hypothesis, which is more widely accepted within academia. It emphasizes an individual's own behavior and perspectives, determining whether somebody's part of a generation or not. They are formed by varying experiences that an individual may have from major phenomenon, and subsequently grouping similarities from there. There can be multiple generations that exist simultaneously for people born within the same time frame, that don't follow any strict rhythmic patterns. An individual is locked into a generation once they personally stop changing. This system, though not perfect, is built on reflecting human behavior itself. But pulse rate hypothesis, this idea of hard and often predictable lines that can be drawn between generations as an objective reality, tied to history in this almost destiny-like rhythm, may sound bizarre. It just groups so many people together. But what do you think helped condition some of these terms into existence? Now we contextualize question 2 a bit more. The first generational category to really hit the mainstream was the baby boomers. It remains as of yet the only generation that the US Census Bureau officially recognizes. And to them it was simply a range that showed massive population growth. Its attention and recognizability though would help condition a way of thinking about generations that complemented pulse rate hypothesis. Eventually, pulse rate would come to dominate how our modern day cultures have come to perceive themselves, especially once the previously mentioned William Strauss and Neil Howe used it as the backbone for their own hypothesis, the Strauss-Howe generational theory, aka fourth turning. This idea would be established in numerous books of theirs, but none arguably more influential than 1991's Generations: A History of America's Future, 1584 to 2069, which would lay the groundwork for later publications of theirs, notably 1997's Fourth Turning. How influential was their work? They coined the term millennial and the alternative Gen Z name Homeland. They also coined the GI generation and helped solidify the name of Generation X. They also developed unique names for countless generations prior to the Lost Generation as part of their hypothesis. They would establish life course associates which would use the influence of their initial publications to push pulse rate generational thinking into the marketplace, something they claimed to have been quite new at the time. They would work on work environment, strategic planning, and straight up marketing to and for generations, with notable emphasis on millennials. Their consultant firm would lead collaborative works with major companies and organizations, including but not limited to Ford Motor Company, Nike, Disney, Fidelity, and even the United States military. The concept of fourth turning has even been pushed into American politics from individuals ranging from Al Gore to Steve Bannon, and numerous organizations have simply adopted their terms and adapted them for their own use. Examples being MetLife and Pew Research Center and so on. Strauss would pass away in 2007, but Howe continues the work to this day, further solidifying his ideas in American society, Anglo-American society, and more recently the world as a whole. So who are they and what's this fourth turning all about? Strauss worked in the Ford White House and was a staffer for the US Senate. Howe was an economic policy consultant and advisor for Concord Coalition, and currently is the managing director of demography at Hedgeye. Between them, they have graduate degrees in economics, history, and law, but they would become pop sociologists with their publication, which developed fourth turning. Their hypothesis argues for the existence of rhythmic, around 20-year generational units, with some exceptions, in order to prove that generations have innate and predictable attributes that appear once at a time within roughly 80-year cycles, that respond to a historical pattern.
The two of us began working. We discovered that, yes, indeed, this had happened before, that American society had pulsed to rhythms both within the family and within the world at large.
They claim each generational unit has either a prophet, nomad, hero, or artist archetype, each followed by each other in that order, in a system that tries to explain the experience, actions, and contributions of a generation at large. All of which is further enforced by peer personality. As a whole, you can't escape it. It's like destiny. That said, it's not widely accepted in academia like any pulse rate system, often criticized as something more reminiscent of a horoscope than an actual theory with genuine predictive capabilities. This is because it relies on equating deeply complex generational issues in order to establish a system that just screams pareidolia. Fourth turning is built on a premise that believes that there has been a long cycle of prophet, nomad, hero, and artist in time. And because of that, it establishes a system that looks like it was built on societal occurrences within the past 100 years or so, and goes on to project that onto the past so that way it can legitimize its predictions for the future. It can be really convincing at face value, which is also aided by its vague claims. But it hasn't gone unnoticed. There are a lot of criticisms concerning the attributes that fourth turning claims certain generations will innately have. Most notably, millennials, the generation that Strauss and Howe coined. Millennials are claimed to have some fundamental similarities concerning growth, experiences, motivation, contributions, and such, with that of other hero generations, like that of the GI generation, which fought in World War II, and the Civil War generation, which fought in the American Civil War, and all the other hero generations, such as the Republican generation, Glorious generation, Elizabethan generation, and the Arthurian generation. Again, it equates complex issues impacting these separate generations with each other, as if all innately contribute to the attributes of a hero archetype they seemingly have. Attributes that none of the other archetypes apparently exhibited or displayed. It just locks everybody up into a given time span, assuming what they're about without taking into consideration factors like geography, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, tradition, arguably technology even, and simply being born on the borders, among other things. Everybody is locked into this cycle. Nomadic Generation X condition millennials to be heroes. Millennials will condition Generation Z to be artists. And after them, once we are done our turning, prophets. And the cycle continues. This is fourth turning, and this has been a considerable influential force into conditioning how we come to perceive and talk about ourselves. It's weird and it's exhausting. So, with all things considered, is this truly the best that we as the public have? There should definitely be an immediate red flag for anybody who is, not American or British. I mean, there is a Puritan generation. And this leads us to the next question. Who does this apply to? These generational units have found their way into public discourse all around the world, and they are based almost exclusively on Anglo-American history, with British history being pretty much ditched after the independence of the US in this system. And Howe makes it abundantly clear to emphasize Anglo-American society when discussing fourth turning in public, only suggesting other societies might have a similar phenomenon. And this might be the single weirdest aspect of this system. What makes us so special? Apparently European American history innately functions in cycles? Wouldn't you want to actively try to see if this system works in other societies to try to legitimize it? Because I would argue China, Brazil, Prussia, the Ottomans had vastly different experiences from the United States, especially from the 1800s back. It would seem like a system that can truly only reflect us Americans, because not every society on Earth had corresponding events that would condition these archetypes. And if it did exist, it would seem that this would be really easy to dig up. But despite all that, societies around the world have been latching onto fourth turning terminology, and subsequently the spacing between these generational units, with previously mentioned countries like that of China, Brazil, and now Germany and Turkey latching onto these terms. Why? Well, you have the prevalence of English throughout the world. These words are new and convenient. There have been a lot of recent global phenomena that have conditioned the more recent generations in the United States that might be able to resonate with people around the world. But most of all, just like the United States, an enormous amount of interest in these terms is creating a demographic to analyze and market towards. They might be oblivious to some of the fallout that can arise when you try to create and enforce a massive social group identity. Because they encompass so many people, you can emphasize on any particular thing you want to demonize them with. Or they might just not really care. There is so much variation within every generation, yet we love to cling to these averages. But averages, without acknowledging that they are an amalgamation of so much complexity, is part of the problem here. Not everybody born within the millennial time frame is part of the same generation. In places around the world, there have been people who have actually created their own generational units, in reflection to significant local events. For instance, Armenia and Vietnam have their own specialized regional generations that they either use exclusively or coinciding with millennials, both of which start in the 1990s, though for different reasons. For Armenia, it was independence from the Soviet Union having dramatic impact. For Vietnam, it was significant economic growth and the adoption of new technologies that exposed its people, and particularly its youth, to the outside world. Having smaller, more specialized generations is a significant improvement, even if we have to have the hard lines and the time frames, rather than multiple specialized generations. This idea and desire for smaller generational units has actually led to the rise of cuspers, specialized generational units that more accurately resonate with people born at the beginning or ends of any given generation. This has brought rise to Zennials, Generation Jones, and the Swing generation. Again, these smaller generations make more sense because they allow for a more accurate representation of who these people are and their experiences. Assuming that we're all just a 20-year average is bonkers. If we're trying to capture the image of a people and properly represent them, we need to look closer. The big challenge is that might cost more money to study and market towards. I know for me, someone born in 1994, I am in a proposed cusper that ranges from 1993 to 1998. I personally have a hard time resonating with people born in the 80s, considering I've had access to the internet throughout my entire waking memory, and I've had access to social media and a smartphone since middle and high school. We don't have an official name yet, but I'd rather be named by one of us. I'm rooting for Generation Kenobi, so we can be called Gen Kenobi, and embrace the fact that the Star Wars prequels were made with mostly us in mind. That we exist in each other's image. But that might just be my sense of humor shining through. So though I have so much I would love to talk about, I think I've made this video long enough. Are generations real? Well, yeah, in a biological context, of course. But these large generational units, complements of pulse rate, that have become the norm in American society and more recently societies around the world are questionable. Not just because fourth turning is a controversial concept, but because of how we are accepting, categorizing the change over time that we see, again, through pulse rate. You should not have to feel compelled to identify with a generation simply because you were born around the same time as them, particularly if you don't share the trends affiliated with them. I don't feel like a millennial most times. There are over 75 million of them in the US alone. I would rather be affiliated with smaller groups, individuals that are more like-minded, behaviorally similar, had similar exposures to particular cultural phenomenon, and that were impacted more similarly to historical events. Imprint hypothesis has unfortunately not been able to step up to the plate, and provide society with terminology to better recognize itself. And it may be too late, I hope not. I will settle with Gen Kenobi if I have to. But I felt compelled to make this video because hopefully this issue can resonate with individuals and maybe help plant the seed for challenging these generational norms we're all dealing with. There are very smart people on YouTube that I have a lot of respect for that have parroted this entire hypothesis. Fourth turning as some accepted truth, but it is not, by far. But the impact is massive, even if you don't buy the hypothesis, and it's gonna get bigger. Does this mean we have to rise up and fight the status quo? Meh, I'll leave that up to you, though I will do my part. I would just recommend for now thinking a little bit more critically about the generations tacked onto us, and some of their origins. Because you might just find that some of them, yours, are only as real as you let them be. And that's the end of the video. My question for all of you is, what are your thoughts on generations?